Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I am your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. We have turned the page in the calendar or flipped it onto your phone, whatever the case might be. We're into April, days away from the federal election. And some of the polling that's coming out in the last couple of days I find is very instructive as to what's happening. First of all, there's a number of different pollsters, many of them very reputable, that are doing the polling these days, and the numbers are starting to show a trend, I think, that's developing. Now, a cautionary tale about this, because I've mentioned this all along, and this is no disrespect to the people that are doing some polling. I've talked to many of them on the program many times, and they're very reputable people, but a poll is a snapshot in time. If you are one of the people that was questioned or online or whether by phone polls, whatever the case might be, it's how you feel that particular day. And we know that people's opinions and minds can change depending on different circumstances. So, I mean, as of April 1st or March 31st, whenever these polls were taken, this is the status. One asking about who do you think is best qualified to lead this nation through the tough economic times. Mark Carney was the choice of an overwhelming majority of Canadians. Poilievre was second, but a very distant second. And when you look at the party polling right now, the Liberals, which, as we mentioned, were down by about 26 points just a few months ago, now seem to have about a 5 or 6 point lead, depending on which poll you're looking at right now. But again, this is not election day. We've got another couple of weeks, 3 weeks, I guess, to go before that happens. But people are starting to pay attention. And I'm seeing this with some of the comments online and some of the responses to some of our previous podcasts. And it seems to indicate that people are starting to figure that $1 million question or multi-million dollar question, I guess, is who's going to handle this? Because it's coming. We know there's a storm coming. The new wave of Trump tariffs are going to be announced over the next little while, and you know it's going to be a kick in the pants to us. And by the way, we're handling this and doing it well, and I'm appreciative of the Canadian attitude here. Elbows up, and we are not for sale. All the things that are happening. It's great to see that the way Canadians are rallying. But let's make no mistake about this: we got some rough times ahead of us. And it's going to get pretty tough here because of the impact of these tariffs, no matter how long they last. And which is why I think many Canadians now are taking a much more sober approach to what's happening in this election and say, wait a second, we can't go with somebody who's just, going to be talking about platitudes and slogans. We need somebody who's actually got a plan and maybe has some experience in economic issues and in handling economic crises. Well, one guy does and the other guy doesn't. And I think more and more Canadians are starting to come to that point, as evidenced by what we've seen recently. As we do the podcast today, I got up early this morning and watched some of the coverage on the major networks. Poilievre was out in the Maritimes, in Newfoundland, and later on in New Brunswick. And he's in hot water again for some of his comments. Now, most of his stuff, as a matter of fact, 99.9% of his stuff is just scripted. So he's just reading off teleprompters, more slogans and more platitudes. But it's the platitudes and the slogans that seem to be getting him into trouble these days. Case in point, talking about housing, and I don't know whose advice it was or who wrote this thing, but all of a sudden, Poilievre is trying to draw a connection between housing and parenting and having children. Let me give you a couple of quotes and some of the response to this. This is right from his comments today in the Maritimes. He says, "We will not forget the single mom who can't afford food," which I found kind of surprising because he voted against a number of initiatives, including raising the minimum wage and a number of other things for people that are financially challenged. But that's his record. He says, "We will not forget the seniors who are choosing between eating and heating." Well, once again, he voted against the housing plan that the Liberals had proposed, which all of the premiers almost all said was the best possible program and very, very successful and a great starting point for what they needed to have. Poilievre wouldn't even support that program. He says, "We will not forget the 36-year-old couple whose biological clock is running out faster than they can afford to buy a home and have kids." That, among all these other platitudes and questionable comments he's making, that one just seemed to hit a nerve with an awful lot of people. And the reaction on social media was quick and rather severe. One woman commenting saying, "A woman's body is not an argument about a housing crisis. Not all women want kids." Another goes on to say, "Wow, this is the weirdest statement. Does he think that only women who own homes can have kids? Seriously out of touch with real life." Another one writes, "Creepy Pierre needs to keep his mouth shut about women's biological clocks." She says, "Canadian women already know he wants to shut down the reproductive rights, and he's apparently still at it." One of the most telling comments, though, about Poilievre's comments came from Dr. Jen Gunter. Dr. Gunter is a Canadian OBGYN, an author, now practicing in the States, but certainly being in touch with what's happening here. And she commented about the comments as well. And she says, "This is the guy who voted against raising the minimum wage, who voted against $10 a day daycare, who voted against school meal programs, and voted against giving dental care to children. Now he's supposed to tell us that he cares about families?" She goes on to say, "Never mind the whole super creepy discussion about your biological clock," which sounds so much like it's straight out of the right-wing tech bro handbook that we get in the States. Obviously, she's working down there and is very privy to what's going on with the Trump administration. But she goes on to write, she says, "Actions speak louder than words. He's had plenty of opportunities to vote for things that can help families, and each and every time he chose not to." Those are the comments of Dr. Jen Gunter reacting to some of Poilievre's platitudes that he's been spouting over the last little while. And it's very much in keeping with what we've talked about on the program many times and the advice that I have given. And it's based on my experience covering politics for so many years. And actually being involved in municipal politics for some time as well. And again, because we can be inundated with social media and with advertising, and now more sadly with foreign interference and bots that are going out there with misinformation. But I always maintain that one thing that you and I both need to do as voters is the old adage about, listen to what they say, but watch what they do. They can promise the sun, the moon, and the stars, but when you got a voting record that says you've never supported any of those programs, can you really believe what they're saying now when they're making these promises? When they had the chance to support programs like that in the past and they always said no? That's the question I think many Canadians are asking these days, and they're not impressed at all with Poilievre's rants and raves and promises, especially when you juxtapose that with his voting record on issues that could have and should have helped. And part of the reason for that, I assume, is that Poilievre, like too many other politicians these days, is guided strictly by ideology. And there doesn't seem to be a shred of pragmatism to what he's done or what he seems to believe in right now. And there is a new book that I talked about a couple of podcasts ago that I think sheds some light on this. And it's a book about Pierre Poilievre. It's called Ripper. And it's written by Mark Burry. Burry, of course, is an author that's covered other political aspects and other people in politics over the last little while. But in this book called Ripper, The Making of Pierre Poilievre, he has one message, the author, that Pierre Poilievre we see today is the same person as the teenager he was in Calgary's Reform Party backrooms. And Burry describes that 1990s teenager, meaning Poilievre, as the political equivalent of a hockey goon, and said he has not adjusted his behavior or outlook since then. And it all goes to mindset and style. He's a belligerent, short-sighted, very angry individual. He paints a portrait of Poilievre as somebody who's simply critical, describing him as the angriest person in Canadian politics and the nastiest leader of any major party in this country's history. It doesn't sound like that's the sort of guy that can bring people together, does it? And as Boer goes on to say, he says, on a personal level, I have nothing against the guy. But he goes on to write that he says he's an angry teenager in the body of a grown man. And that makes him a stellar opposition politician, but a bad combination to be a potential prime minister. Those are Burry's comments in the new book. And I think those are very telling comments because I think it goes to the core of what a lot of us are concerned about right now and thinking about, that is this a guy who can bring people together? The anti-Trump sentiment and the elbows up and, we're not going to be bought and we're not going to be the 51st state. The reaction to that by Canadians has brought us together, well, with the exception of Danielle Smith, apparently, who still is kissing the butt of the guy down in the States right now at Mar-a-Lago pretty much on a consistent basis these days. And the others, so the so-called loyal Canadians, I'm going to use that term advisedly, that seem to be talking like that. Kevin O'Leary, Conrad Black, two people that seem to think this potential partnership with Trump and Canada would be a good thing. It won't. And you have to question their credibility and their loyalty when you hear people like that making comments like that. But we will make up our own mind about this. And again, it goes back, as I mentioned, to track record. Don't just listen to what they say, watch what they do. Poilievre was in government, by the way, for some time. It was not until 2013 He got elected in 2006 as Harper took power, but it was about 7 years later before finally Harper appointed him to a cabinet position. His first job was the Minister of Democratic Reform, and essentially his first piece of legislation was what he called a Fair Elections Act, that editorial writers in the Globe and Mail and even the National Post, the right-wing, ultra-conservative National Post, said that the legislation that Poilievre was proposing at that time was deplorable, destructive, and not the sort of thing that Canada needed. But that Pierre Poilievre, I ask you, has he really changed since then? I think the answer to that is pretty obvious, isn't it? So on it goes. There is a plethora of information. That's why it galled me as we watched the American election some months ago right now. And when you ask people, well, who are you going to support? And they say, well, I don't know. We don't know much about Kamala Harris. That's because you haven't looked. And the same thing applies here. Everything you need to know about Pierre Poilievre is out there. Everything you need to know about Mark Carney is out there. Their track records, their CVs, their work record, what they have attained, what they have proposed, their successes, those who have worked with them and the comments that they have made. It's there. And I implore you, if you haven't yet, please take the time and do that explanation. Okay, and do that kind of investigative work to understand exactly where these guys are. And again, I know we state this on almost every podcast, but we're saying it all the time because it's true. This is the most important election in Canada's history. It is, absolutely. I know we've had elections during wartime and during crises and economic downturns and recessions, but this one, everything's on the table right now. Our future as a country, our future as a sovereign nation, our future economically, it's all there. And we damn well better find somebody who's going to be a leader who can address these problems and not just stand there with platitudes and cliches, little 2 or 3 line cliches or acerbic comments about the opposition parties. That's childish behavior. I'd like to think that as a country, we're past that. And certainly in the time of crisis, we damn well better be past that and start looking at people with leadership capabilities. Which, by the way, is interesting. I'm getting a number of questions from people that are enjoying the podcast. Thank you for that. Saying, well, I've always voted for one particular party, in this case, 4 or 5 of them over the last couple of days. Traditionally, I voted for Conservative, but I don't feel comfortable with Poilievre. Well, unless you've got some blood oath that says you must vote Conservative every time, you're more than free in this country to change your mind. And most Canadians do that from time to time. The overwhelming majority of people that vote in Canadian elections are not tied to a political party. They're not members of the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party, the NDP Party. They're Canadians first. And they may have tendencies, and some of those go back some generations, but there have been times when those have changed. There have been overwhelming majorities of people. The Brian Mulroney huge victory, of course, when he finally defeated John Turner. A lot of people that probably never voted Conservative in that election. Similarly, of course, what happened just a few years after that, when Jean Chrétien was elected, same idea. People that probably didn't traditionally vote for Liberal voted Liberal in that case. All right, you don't tie yourself to one particular party unless, of course, you're one of these hardcore types that are just so motivated and, I guess, feeling that you have to follow this ideology. Desperate times call for desperate measures. Yeah, that's a cliche, but they also call for leadership. And that's what your number one, I think, alternative has to be right now. Who can lead? Going into this, we're finding out more and more about Poilievre. We're finding out more and more about Mark Carney and their attitudes. And we're also finding out how the people that are going to be involved in this global approach and global attempt to try to get this economy back on track are going to be involved. They know Mark Carney, and you're seeing some of those comments, I think, on a pretty regular basis now. So we'll continue to watch this and continue to talk about this. And as always, we look for your input into these. And there's so many important discussions that are happening these days. As we do this podcast, we are awaiting final word just a few hours from now, as a matter of fact, about the latest announcement of Trump and his tariffs, the idiocy that seems to be going on at the White House these days. And we will certainly address that in a future podcast about not just the tariffs themselves, but how is it going to have an impact on us, and not just on a macro picture, but you and me on our everyday lives. But that's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks so much for being with us. Of course, you can catch us on Substack, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube and on Blue Sky. As always, thank you for that. Thank you for the comments. We'll get to your comments and try to respond to them as quickly as we can. It's great to have this dialogue. That's what democracy is all about, an exchange of ideas and opening your mind to other people's ideas, too, that maybe something you said or something this individual said might just say spark in your head to say, that's a point I hadn't thought of. Let's consider something like that. Don't be closed-minded going into this, because the ramifications of that can be disastrous. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly, and stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.